Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
For as long as I can remember, my birthday has felt like an afterthought. A scribbled footnote on a calendar already full of other people's plans. While other kids had cakes with candles and neighborhood treasure hunts, mine was usually a quiet dinner, me, my mom, and maybe a slightly overcooked meatloaf if she remembered to stop by the grocery store on her way home from work. I stopped expecting anything around the age of 12 after I opened a rewrapped gift that I'd bought Emily the year before. But this year somehow managed to dig a little deeper into a wound I'd spent a lifetime pretending didn't bother me anymore. Emily's birthday had been just 2 weeks earlier. We're 4 years apart, but our birthdays fall in the same month, which used to make me think we shared something magical. Like maybe the universe had accidentally given our family 2 daughters close in time, so we'd always celebrate together, like built-in best friends. That fantasy lasted until I was maybe 7, long enough to realize I was the placeholder in her spotlight. This year for Emily's birthday, Mom rented a little corner of that boutique vineyard out near the lake, the one with the string lights and overpriced charcuterie boards. There was a catered brunch with mimosas, matching floral centerpieces, and a custom-made banner that said Emily's Radiant 39. Guests arrived with gift bags full of spa sets and designer scarves. Someone even brought a signed first edition of her favorite novel, something I knew she'd posted about 6 months ago. That's how loved she is, people remember the little things. I stood in the background that day, sipping flat champagne, watching her open a velvet box with a dainty diamond necklace from Mom. The kind of piece you don't just grab at the mall. It was clear she'd been planning this for months. 2 weeks later, on my birthday, I got a text from my mom that said, "Oh no, totally spaced. Sorry, I forgot. Can I bring by some cookies later?" No emoji. Not even a heart. Just crumbs. I stared at the screen for a good minute, wondering if I was overreacting. Maybe she'd been busy. Maybe it had slipped her mind. But birthdays don't just sneak up on you, not when you went all out 2 weeks ago. Not when it's literally your other daughter. And not when you've done this before. I told her fine, sure, whatever. And 3 hours later, she showed up at my front door with a Tupperware container full of cookies that looked like they'd been baked in a rush. Some were half-burnt, others undercooked, all of them stuck together like they'd been dumped straight from the tray into the box. She handed them to me like it was some sacred offering. "I know it's not much," she said, patting my arm with that condescending smile she saves for when she wants to end a conversation before it starts, "but they're homemade." I didn't say much. Just stood there, holding that lukewarm plastic box like it was radioactive. She didn't even come in, just turned, told me to enjoy my day, and walked back to her car like she'd just dropped off a casserole to a neighbor she barely knew. I stood in the doorway long after the engine started, long after she reversed out of the driveway. Not sad. Not angry. Just hollow. I brought the cookies inside and set them on the counter. Stared at them for a while. Opened the lid. Took a whiff. They smelled like cheap vanilla extract and guilt. I didn't eat one. Not even a bite. Just closed the lid and left them there. Later that evening, around 7, Emily called. Not to say happy birthday. No. She wanted to talk about a new rug she was thinking of ordering, some vintage Persian thing she saw online. She was trying to decide between deep red or navy. She asked what I thought, then laughed before I could answer and said, "Never mind. You probably don't care about decor stuff anyway." And just like that, I felt it, the sharp little twist of the knife she always keeps tucked under her words. I told her Mom had dropped off cookies. She said, "Oh, that's cute." At least she did something. Like I was lucky to get scraps. It was then I said it. I don't even know what made me say it. "You should come by. I'll share one with you." My tone must have been too flat because she paused. Asked if I was okay. I told her yes, sure, fine. "You've got a sweet tooth," I added. "They're kind of good." So she came. Drove over in that smug little car of hers with the heated seats and the Boss Babe license plate frame. She always smells like some expensive French brand I can't pronounce, and she never knocks. Just walks in like she owns every room she enters. That night was no different. She dropped her purse on the counter, made some snide comment about the weather, and I handed her a cookie. She took a bite without even asking what kind it was. That's Emily for you. Always assumes everything is made for her, perfectly tailored to her needs, without risk or consequence. 3 seconds later, she stopped talking. Her eyes went wide. She made a sound like a dog choking on a bone. At first, I thought she was joking. Some exaggerated complaint about the texture. But then she gasped again, and her whole body seized, her hand clutching the edge of the sink for balance. "Peanuts," she wheezed, barely able to get the word out. I stood there, cookie still in my hand, and watched her struggle. Watched her fumble in her purse for an EpiPen I wasn't sure she even carried. Her face started to swell, her breaths coming in broken wheezes. And in that moment, I didn't move. I didn't panic. I didn't run to help her. I just watched. Because somewhere between diamonds and crumbs, between I forgot and she didn't mean it, something inside me had gone cold. She hit the floor with a dull thud, still conscious, but barely. Her fingers clawed at the edge of the counter. Her eyes were wild. She was begging me without words. And I turned. Walked out of the kitchen. Not quickly. Just quietly. Maybe you think I'm a monster. Maybe I am. But tell me something, if someone spends their entire life stealing the air out of your lungs, are you really to blame when they finally start to choke? Tell me in the comments. I'll wait. The silence that followed Emily's collapse was not the kind of silence one usually associates with shock or fear, but something thicker, heavier, like the kind that settles over a room when a long-buried truth finally surfaces and dares anyone present to deny it. She was on the floor, curled slightly, face blotchy and contorted, gasping in wet, desperate intervals, while I stood a few feet away, my hands at my sides, not clenched in panic or poised to help, just resting there like I had no more use for them. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish flung from water, but no clear sound came out, only the rattling choke of someone whose body had turned against them in the cruelest way. There is a kind of surreal detachment that creeps in when the rules of the world suddenly flip, when the person who has always moved through life as if nothing bad could ever happen to them, who floats above consequences like they were born immune to them, suddenly finds themselves suffocating on the floor of your kitchen. And in that moment, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel shock. What I felt was something dangerously close to relief, the kind that pulses through your bloodstream like a drug, catching you off guard by how good it feels to see a lie start to crumble under its own weight. I watched her hand slap weakly against the tile as she tried to stabilize herself, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard the voice of my mother from years ago, maybe 2 decades back, maybe 3, saying, "You always overreact, Lauren. Emily didn't mean to hurt you. She's just sensitive. You need to be the calm one." That voice came uninvited, threading itself into my brain like a poison I hadn't quite flushed out after all these years. But now, standing over her as she struggled to breathe, it no longer held power. It felt irrelevant. Eventually, I moved, not because some spark of compassion had suddenly reignited in me, but because I knew it would look suspicious if I didn't at least appear to do something. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911 with the same casual efficiency someone might use when ordering takeout, and when the operator answered with a chipper 911, "What's your emergency?" I responded in a tone that wasn't rushed or panicked, but measured and unsettlingly calm. I told them my sister was having an allergic reaction, that she wasn't speaking, that I thought it might be peanuts, that no, I didn't have an EpiPen, and no, I didn't think she had one on her. I gave them my address. I answered their questions. I followed the instructions. I never once looked directly at Emily while doing so. When the dispatcher asked me if I had administered anything, I said no. When she asked if I knew about my sister's allergy, I paused, just a beat too long, then answered, "I don't think so." I could practically hear the hesitation in her own voice, as if she was trying to decide whether I sounded clueless or criminal. She told me to stay with my sister and help her remain calm. I hung up without replying. By the time the paramedics arrived, sirens howling in the distance like judgment coming down the road, I had moved back to the living room, where I sat quietly on the edge of the couch, my hands folded neatly on my lap, like I was a bystander in someone else's tragedy. They rushed in, professional and composed, and for a moment I watched them work with a kind of detached curiosity, noting how efficient they were at inserting the needle, how practiced they were at checking vitals, how little they asked me. One of them, a young man, no older than 25, turned to me and asked how long she had been like this before I called. I told him about 3 minutes. He didn't question it, just nodded, which somehow felt like both a relief and an insult. I wanted him to ask. I wanted someone to press me, to demand an answer that might expose what had been boiling just beneath the surface for years. They got her stable, or at least stable enough to lift her onto a stretcher and wheel her out the front door. Her eyes met mine briefly as they passed, and in that single glance, there was something unreadable, part accusation, part disbelief, and maybe, just maybe, the first flicker of understanding that I was not the person she thought I was. Or maybe I was exactly that, and she had just never cared to see it. My mother arrived at the hospital less than an hour later, her face drawn tight with panic, her voice cracking over the phone as she barked questions at me. What happened? How could you let this happen? What was in those cookies? And I, still sitting at home with the empty Tupperware in front of me, simply answered, I didn't bake them. Her silence on the other end stretched on long enough for me to imagine her face contorting in confusion. What do you mean? She finally asked. I repeated it. I didn't bake them. You brought them. You dropped them off. She went quiet. Dead quiet. Then she said, well, I didn't put any peanuts in them. I wouldn't do that. And that's when the second silence of the day settled in. Not fear, not confusion, but suspicion. I could hear it crawling into her throat, making her voice shake just slightly, like a woman who's just remembered a detail she wishes she hadn't forgotten. She mumbled something about checking the recipe, then hung up abruptly. I stared at the container again. There were a few crumbs left stuck to the plastic, oily and clinging to the sides. I grabbed a napkin and wiped one out. The smell was faint, but there was something unmistakably nutty in the scent. I tossed the napkin into the trash, walked to the sink, washed my hands, and didn't say another word for the rest of the night. The news from the hospital came just after midnight. Emily had made it. Barely. They had administered the EpiPen just in time. She was sedated, breathing through a mask, stable but still weak. Mom sent a text, just one sentence, she's okay. But she almost died. I read it twice, then replied with a simple, glad to hear. No smiley face. No heart. Just crumbs. There's a particular kind of memory that doesn't fade so much as it festers. It doesn't soften around the edges with time or mellow into something you can smile at, maybe with a shake of the head and a resigned sigh. No. These memories linger like rust in the water pipes, like mold behind the wallpaper, and no matter how much you try to seal them off or convince yourself they've finally stopped staining the surface of your mind, they seep back in at the most unexpected moments, contaminating even the things you thought were safe. As I sat alone in my quiet house, the ghost of Emily's gasping still echoing faintly in my ears, I found myself sinking into that rot again, not because I wanted to, but because sometimes your past doesn't ask permission when it comes clawing its way back to the front of your mind. The first time I really knew I was invisible was on a humid August afternoon in the summer of 1989, back when Emily was still the cute toddler everyone cooed over, and I was the slightly awkward 9-year-old who had learned, far too early, that being good didn't make you special. It just made you easy to ignore. We were in the living room of our old house, the one with the warped hardwood floors and the scratchy green carpet Mom never got around to replacing, and Emily had spilled an entire pitcher of grape Kool-Aid on the white couch. I remember watching her face twist into this dramatic little pout right before Mom stormed in, eyes scanning the mess like a detective stepping onto a crime scene. Emily pointed at me, without hesitation, without remorse, and said I did it. She didn't even flinch. And my mother, who hadn't even been in the room, turned on me so fast I thought my neck would snap from the whiplash. You've got to stop being so clumsy, Lauren, she snapped, grabbing a rag from the kitchen. Why do you always have to ruin everything? I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just sat there, numb and quiet, while Emily blinked at me from behind her lashes, smug as a cat who'd knocked something off the table just to see it break. That was the pattern. Again and again. Over and over. And it didn't stop when we got older. If anything, it grew more sophisticated, more vicious in its subtleties. I remember the night Emily came home from prom with lipstick on her neck and a corsage from my date. I had spent weeks looking forward to that dance, saved my allowance for a dress I knew wasn't designer, but made me feel beautiful anyway, practiced my makeup in the mirror every night like it was a kind of armor. And then, just 2 hours before we were supposed to leave, Josh called and said he wasn't feeling well. I believed him. I even cried. Then I saw Emily's shoes by the door at 2 in the morning. High heels I hadn't seen before. She never even tried to hide it. When I confronted her, she laughed. "You're being dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes. "It was just a dance. You're always so sensitive, Lauren." And Mom? Mom told me to let it go. That sisters fight. That boys come and go. That Emily didn't mean to hurt me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask what Emily did mean to do. But instead, I swallowed it. Like always. Like good daughters do. Years later, the cycle continued. When I finally got married, it wasn't Emily who stood by my side at the altar, even though she made sure to tell everyone she turned down the maid of honor role because she was too emotional for weddings. What she didn't mention was that she'd been sleeping with Greg behind my back just 6 months before we said I do. She cried when I found out. She said she was lonely. That it just happened. That she was sorry. And Mom, again, came in with the same tired script she had memorized by now. "Don't throw away your marriage over a mistake. Emily didn't mean it. You've always been stronger than her." That was always the undercurrent, the unspoken rule in our family. I was the strong one. Which was just another way of saying I was the one expected to endure everything and keep smiling. Because when someone is always hurting you, but everyone insists they love you, you start to believe that maybe pain is just another form of affection, maybe silence is strength, and bitterness is just a character flaw you're supposed to scrub out like mildew. So no, watching Emily choke on my kitchen floor wasn't the first time I stood by while she reaped the consequences of her choices. It was just the first time nobody rushed in to stop them. It was the first time the universe didn't bend over backwards to save her. And as those memories wrapped themselves around me like a familiar noose, I realized something strange. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel shaken. What I felt was vindicated, not because she had almost died, but because for once, the scales tipped even slightly in my direction. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. A message from Mom. "Doctor says she's recovering. They want to keep her overnight for observation. She asked about you." I didn't reply right away. I went to the kitchen, opened the trash bin, and looked at the cookie container again, empty now, save for a single crumb stuck in the corner, hardened and glinting under the light like it had something to say. I picked it up, examined it closely, and then flicked it into the sink. Back at the counter, I picked up my phone, typed a reply, and stared at it for a long time before hitting send. "Let me know if she dies. I'll send flowers." I knew it was cold. I knew it would hurt. But I also knew that nothing I could say would ever come close to the slow, grinding ache I had carried for 43 years, a pain that was never named, never mourned, just constantly covered over with a fresh batch of lies and baked goods. And in that moment, I didn't care if I sounded heartless. I didn't care if she showed that message to Emily, or to the doctors, or to the entire damn family group chat. Because sometimes, silence is mistaken for peace. And sometimes, a cruel truth is the only language that finally makes people listen. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The strange thing about people who have spent their entire lives walking all over others is that they're always absolutely stunned when they finally trip, as if the world has somehow betrayed them by not rising to cushion their fall just one more time. And in the days following Emily's allergic reaction, after the chaos had settled into something quieter but no less charged, I watched almost with scientific detachment as every person in our orbit began moving like satellites around a new, unfamiliar center of gravity, one where I, for the first time in decades, was no longer orbiting quietly at the edges, but was instead regarded with suspicion, curiosity, and, perhaps most satisfying of all, a little bit of fear. It began the morning after she was released from the hospital. A group text lit up on my phone around 7 a.m., one of those forced family chat threads that usually lay dormant until holidays or health scares. This one was clearly ignited by my mother, who sent a photo of Emily in bed, looking pale and slightly puffy around the eyes, with an oxygen tube resting lightly under her nose like a prop in a school play. The caption read, "Our brave girl, home safe at last. Thank you, God." I didn't respond. I didn't click the heart reaction. I didn't reply with a praying hands gif or a flower emoji or whatever saccharine nonsense the rest of the family thought appropriate. I simply watched as my cousins, aunts, and two of Emily's friends from high school chimed in with variations of "so glad you're okay" and "scary." Sending love. Not one of them mentioned me. Not one person asked what had actually happened or how the cookies had come to contain peanut butter. Because no one really wanted to know. They wanted a villain and a victim, and the roles had already been assigned before anyone had heard a single fact. It was late that afternoon when I got the first phone call, from Greg, of all people. My ex-husband's name lighting up my screen felt almost laughably surreal, like the universe had decided the script wasn't quite dramatic enough and needed a cameo from a character nobody missed. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up, curious to hear what brand of concern or judgment he had to offer. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Did you really do it?" he asked, his voice low, like he was already convinced of the answer but needed to hear it aloud, maybe so he could repeat it to someone else later with the gravity of personal knowledge. I didn't respond right away. I walked to the window, looked out at the driveway, and then said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "What do you think I did, Greg? Gave her a cookie." There was a pause, and then a heavy sigh, the kind you hear from someone who wants you to know how hard it is for them to be involved in this conversation at all. "Lauren," he said, "people are talking. Your mom's telling everyone it was just an accident, but you know how that sounds." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he of all people had no right to lecture me on morality, considering the last time he stepped foot in this house, he left behind a pair of boxers under my sister's bed. But instead, I said, if people want to talk, let them. I've been silent my whole damn life. Maybe it's time they wondered what I was thinking. Later that week, Marcia arrived unannounced, which was her way of pretending everything was normal, because in her mind, unannounced visits were reserved for mothers whose daughters had simply gone through a rough patch, not for mothers confronting the possibility that one of their children might have intentionally harmed the other. She walked in with a casserole dish wrapped in foil and a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't invite her in, but she breezed past me anyway, heading straight for the kitchen as if reclaiming a territory she believed still belonged to her. She placed the dish on the counter, turned to face me, and for a moment just stood there, wringing her hands like she was rehearsing a script she didn't quite believe in. "We all make mistakes," she began, her voice softened to that sing-song lilt she used when trying to smooth over something deeply cracked. "I don't know what happened that day, Lauren. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe you were upset. But Emily, she could have died. And I think what matters now is that we move on." I stared at her, not with anger, but with a growing, bitter fascination. Because even now, with everything that had happened, she still couldn't bring herself to ask the real questions. She didn't want the truth. She wanted the illusion of peace restored, so she wouldn't have to confront the possibility that the daughter she had neglected for over 4 decades might have finally stopped pretending to be okay. "I didn't bake the cookies," I said, slowly and clearly, watching her carefully for a reaction. She blinked. "But I gave them to you." "You did. And I never opened the container. Just put them on the counter. Emily came by, took one. The rest you know." Her lips parted, just barely. "They weren't supposed to have peanuts. I used that same recipe I've used since you girls were little." "Well," I said, "someone must have switched it." The silence that followed wasn't accusatory or shocked. It was the kind of silence people fall into when they're doing frantic math in their heads, trying to backtrack, retrace, erase control. She turned away, adjusted the foil on the casserole, and muttered, "Maybe I used the wrong jar. I thought it was almond butter. The label was missing." I didn't answer. I let her sit with the possibility that her mistake, not mine, might have nearly killed the daughter she had always favored. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, not about Emily's safety, but about her own narrative unraveling. She left shortly after, saying she had to get dinner going, though the dish she'd brought was clearly meant to feed both of us. I didn't bother unwrapping it. I dumped it in the trash 5 minutes after she drove off. That night, I got another text from Emily. Just 2 words, "Can talk." I didn't answer right away. I stared at those words until they blurred, because I wasn't sure anymore who I was dealing with. The sister I remembered would have blamed me, would have posted vague quotes on social media about betrayal and overcoming, would have played the victim until she drained every ounce of attention from the room. But this version, the one who nearly died on my kitchen floor, wanted to talk. So I typed back, "Tomorrow." Then I shut off my phone, poured a glass of wine, and for the first time in years, didn't brace myself for the next apology I would be expected to give. Because I wasn't sorry. And I didn't want to be. Not anymore. By the time Emily pulled into my driveway the following afternoon, the sky was already beginning to shift from bright and cloudless to the low, dull gray that always came before a storm, the kind of color that made you feel like the air was holding its breath, waiting for someone to say the one thing that would tip the entire atmosphere over into chaos. I watched her from the kitchen window as she stepped out of her car with slow, measured movements, not the usual confident swing of her hips and flutter of designer accessories that used to announce her presence like a parade float, but something smaller, more cautious, as if she were unsure whether the ground beneath her would hold steady this time. Her face, still slightly puffy from the allergic reaction, lacked the effortless beauty she usually wielded like a weapon, and instead bore the unmistakable signs of someone who had come face to face with their own mortality and wasn't quite sure what to do with the aftertaste. I didn't go to the door. I let her knock, 3 soft raps, not timid but deliberate, like she was testing the waters of a new reality where the balance between us had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone by tears or charm or Mom's ridiculous sugar cookies. When I finally opened it, neither of us smiled. There was no hug, no dramatic gasp of reconciliation, just a long moment of shared silence, thick with all the things we hadn't said in years. All the words we'd buried beneath pleasantries and passive aggression and unspoken resentments passed back and forth like heirlooms no one wanted. She stepped inside and stood in the foyer, eyes sweeping over the familiar furniture, the photographs on the wall, the bowl of oranges on the counter that had sat untouched since last week, and for a moment it felt like we were 12 and 16 again. 2 girls caught in the storm of a house that only knew how to divide and conquer. I gestured toward the kitchen table, and she followed, seating herself slowly like someone unsure of their welcome, but unwilling to admit it. We sat across from each other, hands folded, backs straight, the ghost of that cookie still hovering between us like an accusation. "I remember everything," she said finally, her voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual affectations. "The smell. The way my throat closed. The way you didn't move." She looked at me with something like disbelief, not horror exactly, but the kind of stunned recognition that someone close to you is capable of something you'd always assumed was beyond them. "You just stood there, Lauren." I didn't respond right away. I wanted to choose the words carefully, not out of guilt or fear, but because this was the first conversation in decades where I had nothing to lose. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "I did. I stood there. I watched you choke. I didn't move." Her face didn't change. She didn't cry. She just nodded slightly, as if confirming some private suspicion she'd carried with her since the incident, and then she said something that caught me completely off guard. "You weren't surprised." I tilted my head. "No," I said slowly. "I wasn't." She exhaled through her nose, looked away, then back at me. "You knew about the peanuts?" I leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to defend myself, to soften the blow or water down the truth into something more palatable. "Of course I knew. Everyone knew. You've been allergic since you were 5. But I didn't make the cookies." She flinched slightly, then narrowed her eyes, parsing every word like a lawyer scanning a confession. "Then who did?" "Mom," I said. "She dropped them off. Said she wanted to make it up to me." Her lips parted, a small breath escaping as her mind raced through the implications. She wouldn't. She knows not to use peanut butter. I shrugged. She said the label was missing. Thought it was almond butter. We sat there in silence, the weight of that possibility slowly settling between us like dust on old furniture, and I could see it hitting her, the realization that the woman who had built her up, protected her, excused her, even enabled her every misstep, might have been the one who almost ended her without even realizing it. Or maybe she had realized it. Maybe she hadn't cared. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, not in pain, but as if trying to hold herself together. Do you think she did it on purpose? I looked at her for a long moment. I don't know, I said. But she brought those cookies, and she didn't check the label, and she didn't seem all that surprised when I told her what happened. So maybe she didn't do it on purpose, but she sure as hell didn't care enough to stop it. Emily shook her head slowly. You could have warned me. I could have, I agreed. But I didn't. And maybe I wanted to see what it felt like, to let you feel what it's like when someone you trust feeds you something poisonous and then acts like it's your fault for swallowing it. For the first time since she walked in, she seemed to shrink in her seat, the weight of it all pressing down on her like a collapsing ceiling. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She just sat there, nodding, as if she finally understood the enormity of everything she had overlooked, the years she had spent mistaking favoritism for love and entitlement for affection. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, I said. I'm not looking for an apology. I don't need you to cry. I just want you to sit with it. I want you to feel it. For once. She stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust from her jeans, and walked to the door without another word. I followed her, and as she stepped outside, she paused, turned halfway, and said, You think Mom didn't know? It was a question so quiet, so loaded, that it felt more like a confession. I didn't answer. She didn't wait. She got in her car, closed the door, and drove off without looking back. I stood in the doorway long after the sound of her engine had faded, the question still ringing in my ears like a bell I couldn't unring. And the truth was, I didn't know what I believed anymore. Because maybe it had been an accident, and maybe it hadn't. Maybe I was the villain, and maybe I wasn't. But as I closed the door behind me and turned back toward the quiet of my house, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not peace, exactly, but something close to clarity. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care whether anyone else understood it. Because the cookie might have been the beginning. But I had been choking on silence for 43 years. And maybe, just maybe, it was time someone else swallowed the truth for once.